What is up, guys? This is Danny with Plug and Play, and today we're going to learn how to make this cool liquid blob trail rig inside of After Effects. We're going to set up a bunch of different properties to control the rig. We're going to learn about velocity. We're going to set up a bunch of different expressions and add the correct effects to get a great looking animation. Now, if you prefer to dive right in with the click of a button, feel free to check out our latest tool, Splash. It allows you to generate multiple trails and blobs very easily and provides like 25 plus properties to animate, so it's kind of cool, and you get access to all these different presets and you can save your own. So yeah, that's available right now on aescripts.com, so feel free to go check that out. But enough promo, let's get right to the tutorial. So this is what the effect looks like that we're going to be generating today. As you can see, we got this really cool liquid blob flying around the screen, and then also a bunch of liquid particles that are being generated from that blob. Now, this is all being driven from this control and null layer here. And we have different parameters inside of this control layer to control things such as which layer we're going to be grabbing the position from, the amplitude of the particles that we're generating, so the amount of particles that we're generating, the random distribution of those particles, the speed threshold for at which speed we actually start generating particles from the blob, the velocity of those particles, the lifespan of those particles, and also the stretch of the blob that we have flying around the screen, along with what color the blob and particles are. So if we go into a new composition here, let's go ahead and let's make a new shape layer. Let's make sure the fill on this shape layer is white, and let's rename this shape layer to be Blob. Now let's go inside of our effects and let's add particle playground to this shape layer. Now there's a bunch of different particle generators inside of After Effects, but particle playground is a really powerful particle generator and it has a bunch of depth to it. So we have all these different drop down menus here where we can really dive in and make this particle generator conform to exactly what we want it to do. So inside of the cannon, this is basically the default particle generator inside of Particle Playground. We can control things such as the position, the barrel radius, particles per second, the direction of those particles, the random spread of those particles, the velocity random spread, the color of the particles, and also the particle radius. Going down the line here, we have the grid, and this allows us to generate a grid of particles across our composition. We have the layer exploder, and this allows us to take an existing layer inside of our timeline and explode a bunch of particles from that layer. We also have the particle exploder, and this allows us to generate new particles based on existing particles. We have things such as the layer map, and this allows us to map a composition or layer to a specific particle inside of the particle playground here. So if we wanted to create, let's say, a swarm of bees, we could import a bee image and select this layer map layer to be that bee image, and now every single particle that's generated will be of that bee. Now, of course, there's a lot more depth to this effect, and we can obviously drop down this effects drop down menu here and kind of play around with at which point the frame is taken from and a bunch of other good stuff inside of there. Going down the line here, we have things such as gravity, pretty self-explanatory. We have things such as repel, which will repel the different particles from each other. We have things such as the wall, and that is if we draw a layer mask on this layer, we can use that mask to create some sort of boundary for these particles. Now these bottom two, the persistent property mapper and the ephemeral property mapper, I am so sorry, I'm definitely butchering that name. I really do not know how to pronounce that properly, so please excuse me. But these two will allow us to use a layer map to drive a variety of different properties over the lifetime of that particle. So the difference between the persistent property mapper and the ephemeral property mapper is basically the persistent property mapper will use the frame of the layer map for when the particle is generated. So if a specific particle was generated at, let's say, the 10-second frame, this persistent property mapper will only use the frame of that layer map at 10 seconds. And that will be used for the lifetime of that particle. Now that's in contrast to the Fmural property mapper, which basically will allow us to animate that layer map, and that can change how we drive the different attributes, the different parameters here with that layer map. So very kind of confusing stuff here. I'm still confused myself, but if you want to learn more, definitely jump over to the documentation on the particle playground here. Adobe's done a great job of going super in depth into what all these different parameters mean, especially the persistent and ephemeral change here. But to kick off this tutorial, let's go ahead and let's set up this particle playground to generate the blob. So first things first, let's go ahead and select this particles per second, and let's crank this up to be 5,000. We'll set the direction random spread to be 0. We'll select the velocity to be 0. We'll set the particle radius to be 19. And let's go ahead and go into gravity and select the force to be 0. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and let's make a new null object, and let's call this control. Alright, so let's start by adding some position keyframes to this control layer. You can obviously just keyframe this control layer and start moving the control layer around willy-nilly. I'm actually just going to grab the keyframes from the position of this existing control layer here. So I'm going to go back over here, I'm going to delete these keyframes, and I'm going to paste in these position keyframes and drag them to the beginning of our timeline here. Great. Now let's go back to our control layer and let's look up a new effect called layer control. And let's add this layer control effect to this control layer. Let's go back into Blob and let's alt click on the position of this cannon. Now let's go and let's select this null object called control. Let's go back to our expression input box here and let's set a new variable and let's call this player. And let's set that equal to this layer control up here. And now with a semicolon, now let's go player dot transform dot position, and now with the semicolon. And before too long, we got our blob being mapped to the position of this control layer. Again, why we set up this layer control up here is so we can select which layer we are grabbing the position from. So now we have this nice looking trail going on here, but obviously this looks nothing like a blob. So let's go ahead and let's add a new effect to this control layer called slider control. Drag this onto this null, and we're going to be renaming this effect to be stretch. Great. Let's go into this blob layer and let's go down to the ephemeral property mapper. Let's select the layer map to be blob, and let's set the map red to be scale. We're going to set the maximum scale to be 0 actually, and now we're going to go into effects and we're going to alt click on this older / younger than, and now we're going to go back up to this null layer, select that. Let's go back down to this expression input box, take our pick whip tool and drag that to be stretch, and let's do divided by 800 here. Great, we can go ahead and copy this expression, and now let's alt click on this age feather. Let's paste in that expression. We're going to set some parentheses around this, and then let's do plus, paste this in again, put some parentheses around this, and let's set this to be, instead of 800 at the end, let's set it to be 1000. And now with a parenthesis and a semicolon. Oh. Okay, so now this is what your expression should look like for age feather and for older / younger than. And if we go up to our control layer here and start cranking up this stretch, you can see that we start having a taper to this blob as it's moving throughout our composition here. And if we scroll through, that taper gets smaller and smaller when it's at standstill. And as we speed up, that tail or that taper is going to get much longer. And that's going to be easily driven by this new stretch slider control that we just set up. So now let's make this look a lot more like a blob instead of this pixelated mess that we have going on. So let's go to our effects and presets, look up an effect called fast box blur, and let's drag that to the shape layer. And let's look up another effect called curves. Let's add that to the shape layer as well. Let's set the blur radius to be 8. And let's go to this curves, go to channel, go to alpha, and let's crank down these 2 in and out points so that we're really clamping down on the alpha that gets out of this layer here. And this is a really nice way for kind of making softer edges based on a bunch of really jagged, pixelated edges that you have going on. So as you can see, once we move these 2 in and out points together, we have a much more rounded off edge here. Now, if we do a little RAM preview, we're starting to look like a blob. Starting to look pretty good. The next portion of this tutorial is where we're going to learn how to set up the spray layer. And that is going to allow us to get that really nice particle liquids coming off of this blob layer as it moves throughout our composition. So some things to note, I changed the control layer to be controller, and the reason for that is that I had all my expressions set up to be looking at controller and not control, and I'm lazy and didn't want to change it, so sorry. Moving on, I added a bunch of new slider controls inside of this controller null, and those are amplitude, random distribution, speed threshold, velocity, lifespan, and then also a color control, which is going to allow us to control the color of both the particles and the blob. So let's start off by duplicating this blob layer. And if we hit double E while we have that layer selected, it's going to bring up any expressions that we have on that layer, and we can go ahead and delete those for now. Now let's go ahead and let's go inside of that blob 2 layer. We can rename this to be spray. Let's go inside of the position of the cannon on particle playground. I'll click on that, and let's paste in this new expression. So in effort to expedite this tutorial, I'm just going to be pasting in these expressions and then dissecting them, as opposed to just having you guys watch me code all of them and take up your whole day. But if you want to have access to these expressions, feel free to look in the description of this video. So going down the list here, I have a few different variables set up. First being distance, and that is just a number. The second is P layer, and again, that's going to be looking at the layer selector in that controller null. After that, I have speed, and that is looking at P layer. So again, that layer selector that I have in the controller layer, and we're going to be looking at the transform.position, so the position of that selected layer, but more importantly, the speed of that selected layer. And we're going to be dividing that speed by 500,000. Where did I get that 500,000? Basically, I just played around with a bunch of different variables and found out that 500,000 worked well for this instance. After that, I have p.layer, .transform.position, .value at time. So we're looking at the position of that selected layer inside of controller, and also the value of that position at time. Which time are we looking at? Well, we are looking at the current time, so time, minus speed times distance. So the reason for that is that when we have these spray particles being generated, if we're at a point in time where we have a fairly long tail on our blob, we don't want those spray particles to be generated at the front of this blob, but more towards the back of it. So the way this expression works is the speed of that blob increases, or the speed of that controller layer that we set up increases, the further back this position of the spray is going to be. And if we want to move that even further back or closer to the front, we can play around with this distance variable here. Let's go back to our spray layer, and now we can go ahead and all click on the particles per second stopwatch, and let's paste in this new expression here. This one's a big one. This is what is going to be driving how many and when we are producing particles from this spray layer. And running down the list here, again, we have that P layer variable that is looking at the layer selector in that controller null. We have the speed of that layer that we have selected in that controller null. We have threshold, and that's going to be pointed at the slider control in this controller. We have an amplitude variable, and that again is going to be looking at the amplitude in this controller layer. These are multiplied by 10 for the threshold and then multiply by 0.01. The reason for that is so that the end user doesn't have to crank up that slider control inside a controller a whole bunch or a very fine amount in order to get the desired effect. Moving forward, we have a random distribution variable, and you guessed it, that is tied to the random distribution slider control inside of controller. That one is going to be multiplied by 0.005, and below that we have a little random variable. And the way that random works inside of After Effects is that we are going to be able to generate values that are in between a minimum and a maximum amount. So for the minimum, I have 0.5 minus random distribution. And for the maximum, I have 0.5 plus random distribution. So the thought process behind that is when random distribution is cranked up to 100, we will have 0.5 minus 0.5, which will result in a minimum random value of 0 and a maximum random value of 1. And if we have that random distribution set to 0, then this is going to be 0.5 for the minimum, 0.5 for the maximum. In other words, we're going to be generating no random variables, just 0.5. After that, I have an if-then expression set up, and this is what we're going to use to dictate at which speed we're actually generating these new particles. So if the speed of that selected layer inside of the controller layer is greater than the threshold that we have set up inside of that controller layer, we're going to be running this little expression here, which is basically going to be speed, i.e. the speed of that selected layer that we have set up, times the amplitude, times random. So that allows us to generate more particles per second when the selected layer and the layer control is moving quicker. And we can also impact that with our amplitude, along with giving it some sort of randomness with the random variable that we set up here. And if the speed is not greater than the threshold, then we'll just result in having 0 particles emitted. Moving forward, let's go ahead and go back to this spray layer, go to the particle playground, and let's all click on direction. From here, we can go ahead and input this new expression that we have. And how this expression works is, again, we have that P layer variable set up to look at the layer selector inside of that controller. After that, we have driver position, which is going to be looking at the position of that selected layer. Then we have the velocity of that driver position, or the selected layer that we have in that controller layer. And velocity works by exporting an array of how quickly an object is moving in both X, Y, and Z. So once we have that array of how quickly or how much velocity an object has in a given direction, we can then change that velocity or that array to be degrees using this radians to degree expression here. Once we have which direction that object is moving in, we can change that to degrees, add 90 degrees to that, and then we are set up and good to go for the direction. Next thing that we can start affecting is the velocity. So let's go ahead and go back to that particle playground. I'll click on velocity, and let's enter in this new expression here. Inside of this expression, funny enough, we have that same P layer player variable set up to be looking at the layer selector instead of that controller. And we have velocity set up to be that velocity slider inside of this controller. So this guy right here. After that, we're multiplying that velocity by 0.01. And again, that's just so that it's easier on the end user to fine tune this parameter a little bit more. After that, we're going to be looking at the speed of that selected layer, and we're just going to be multiplying that by that velocity. The reason that we have that selected layer's speed times velocity is so that when that selected layer is speeding up, the velocity of those new particles is going to be even more. It's going to be greater. It's going to be impacted by how quickly that object is moving. And then we can alter even more how quickly or how slowly those particles are moving based on this velocity slider here in the controller. Alright guys, almost at the end here. Last couple things that we really need to do are go into this, again, spray layer. We can go down into the Fmural. Again, I'm sure I'm butchering that. Please excuse me. Go into this property manager, and we'll go ahead and go into the effects. Let's all click on this older/younger than. paste in this expression, which is basically looking at the controller null and then the lifespan slider inside of that controller null. And then we're going to be dividing that by 2. And then if we all click on this age feather right below it, we can go ahead, paste that same expression in, and then get rid of that divided by 2. And we will be good to go, guys. Let's see if our work is panning out for us. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on. If we go back to the controller here, we can go ahead and let's change down this velocity to be something more like 10. So now we have a little bit of a straighter line going on. For that lifespan, let's set this to be more like 3 maybe. For amplitude, let's select this and drop this down to be about 10. For random distribution, we can crank this up to 80. For speed threshold, let's crank this up to be like 120. For velocity, let's set this to be around 13. So we're looking pretty good. I think there's one more thing that we need to do here is go into the particle radius. Yes. So of the spray layer, let's go ahead and set the particle radius to be 8. And let's play it back. All right, guys, this is how we're looking so far. Pretty great in my opinion. I think there's a little bit of adjusting that we can do with the curves and the blur here. So let's go into this curves. Let's go to a point with a lot of different particles going on. And I think we can move this back a little bit further. Let's see how perfect we are. Oh, that is perfect. Last thing we need to do is let's go to the effects and presets and let's look up a turbulent displace. Let's throw that on top of this new spray layer and let's set this amount to be 20. I think this one was 10. And then how are we looking? What the turbulent displace will do is basically just give us a little bit more movement going on with these particles so that they're not just falling into a straight line. It kind of looks like there's some external force impacting them a little bit, or maybe like they're hand drawn a little bit. Let's see what I have here. 30 and 15. Pretty close, pretty close. All right, so 30 and 15. And I forgot one more thing that we need to do. Let's go inside of this spray particle playground. Let's all click on color. Let's click on control. Let's go back to color and let's pick whip the color to be the color control. And then let's copy this expression, go to blob, and then we're going to be doing the same thing for the color over here. I'll click, paste, boom. Now we can control the color pretty easily. I hope so. Nice, nice. All right, guys, that is looking really good. Well, guys, that is that, and thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned a little bit more about expressions and how they can be used to make some pretty powerful tools. We put a lot of work into this tutorial and even more into our new liquid animation plugin, Splash. If you would like to support the channel, pick up a copy and share your results to get featured on our channels. Anyways, this has been Danny with Plug and Play.